In Vue 10, a new texture map node was added, the Multi-Image Sampler. It's a really cool node, and in 10.5 it's gotten a huge time-saving feature added to it. We're going to be taking a look at that right now. If you want to follow along, this scene I have loaded in. You can load in from the project content directory, from the scenes, and it's called Terrain for Multi-Sample. So I'm going to go ahead and select the terrain and edit the material. It's just a reset material, so it's completely blank. What we're going to do is edit the function, so right click on the color production, edit function. And what we need to start out with first is just kind of a base color that we're going to put our textures on top of. So I'm going to start by adding a color map or a color node, and I'm going to change it over to color brightness variation. And I'm going to go ahead and change the color to something a little more of a gray, desaturated. And we'll go ahead and take a look and see how that is going to turn out. Maybe it needs to be a little more red. I'm going to turn down my color variation. So the RGB value of this is red 151, green 147, and blue 138. Increase my brightness variation, contrast a little bit. We can adjust our noise scale. I'm going to turn down the saturation value. Maybe we can just kind of tweak that a little. Increase the roughness a little. So that'll just act as our sort of background in sort of the base material color. So what we want to add next, or what we need to add, is a combiner node. And this is another feature that was added in Vue 10, and it's the image combiner. So I'm going to connect the first input to that color brightness, and then we can go ahead and delete the current textures or the current nodes down here for the default material, and take the connection from the color output and connect it to that image combiner. So now we just have the color brightness variation. So now what we can do is start connecting additional color inputs to this. And basically it needs to be something with sort of a built-in alpha. And that way it'll blend together properly. Otherwise it'll just completely overlay it. So what we're going to add in is a texture map node. You can also right click and add a texture map node, and we're going to be using the multi-image sample. I'm going to go ahead and change this one over to the multi-image sample. Now with the original version of this, what you would do is add in a channel, and you would select whether or not you'd want a color or a grayscale channel. And I'm going to select color. And then what you could do is load in an image. And within the project content folder provided with the training, you're going to find a textures folder that has a folder called rock sequence in it. So you can go ahead and load in the first image of that. So here's the textures folder, and then we've got rock sequence, and we only need to select the first rock image, so rock underscore 0001. Now, the image combiner uses different types of alpha information depending on the image format. You could do a TIFF file with an alpha embedded channel in order to act as the alpha. Now, what I've done just to save on file size is I've actually clipped out the image itself. It's not a mask. So I actually cut out the image and saved it as a PNG file. So if we were to just take a look at the image within Photoshop, I'm just going to add a layer really quick and just add a gradient behind it, so you can see that it's just a single layer, it's completely cut out, as opposed to using a channel, which would be an alpha channel on, or below rather, the current channels of the image. And that would work great for TIFF images, and if you don't want to destroy the original texture. It does end up using a bit more memory for the file size, so I decided just to use the PNG format, which should work out rather nice with Vue, because Vue does tend to favor smaller file sizes for textures. So there are 11 total images in the sequence. And I'm just going to flip through them really quick. And now what we would normally do, or in just Vue 10, you would have to add a channel for each one of these images and then load them in. Well, now what we can do is, if you go to, or after you've added the first file within the sequence, and you do have to make sure that it is named as a sequence, so we have 0001, and then the next one 0002, and so on. So what we would do is replace this 1 with an asterisk, and we can just hit enter. And then it's going to go through and load in all the images of the sequence up to that digit. So because we have 11 images, what it's doing right now is only going to load up to, I believe, number 9. And what we can do, it's down at the bottom, there are arrows, so we can now go through and take a look at each of the images. And there's number 9. So it loaded up to number 9. So if you have anything beyond that first digit, what we can do is remove one of the zeros before the asterisk and hit enter, and now it'll load in the rest of the images. So that'll, in this case, load all the way up to, we could have up to 100 or 99 images. So now it automatically distributes these as their own channel. You can even go through the individual images and rotate, and these transformations are applied to each image separately. It does not affect all of them, so you can go through and modify the different images separately, which is pretty nice. You could even invert them or change the gamma if you wanted to. So if you're not really completely familiar with this node, what we have on the bottom is a density control, and what it's going to do is basically, like an ecosystem, put samples and populate these images onto our object, and in this case, terrain. So what we want to do is now connect the image combiner to the multi-image sampler. And as you can see, it automatically takes the alpha information and passes it through, which is really nice, because in previous versions of Vue, at least prior to Vue 10, you would have to take the alpha information separately and use other combiner nodes in order to kind of cut them out. So by using the image combiner, you can automatically pass through the alpha information of any texture that has an embedded alpha. So we can adjust the overall density, and that's the full coverage of how many samples there are. We have a couple of variation options. We can rotate the samples within a certain range. So if we don't want to go from 0 to 360, we can limit it so it doesn't rotate completely around. We could also scale the samples so that they're not all the same size. We could have them varied, and then you can even turn off the key proportions and have the axes be independent of their scale. And then we have the global sample scale, which is going to control the overall scale of the textures, and this is one of the primary controls, because depending on the mapping mode that you're using, the size of the object, this can be really important. So I'm going to go ahead and just start by typing in 0.5 and 0.6 for the global sample scale. And also, if you're using lower resolution textures, or you're going to end up getting a little closer to them, you will want to make sure that you are turning on an interpolation type. Bilinear should work just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and just click OK, and we're going to take a look at what this currently looks like. I'm going to go ahead and render that out. Now we are going to need to make some changes to the scale, because right now the mapping mode is set to world standard. So the texture size, and I did change it to 0.5, which would be good for a parametric mode. But for the world standard mode, it's way too small. So this is just that color variation, and this is with the texture maps, so you can hardly even see them. So we have a couple of options. We can change the overall mapping mode of the surface, but then that will modify the color brightness variation. So what we could also do is change the global sample scale. So first, let's just take a look, and I'll show you. We'll switch it to the object parametric mode, and I'll go ahead and re-render that. So this is the object parametric mode. As you can see, it's a huge difference. Basically, the sample size is almost relative to the size of the terrain itself with the parametric mode. So with the scale set to around 0.5 or so, or a little lower, each sample is only about half of the size of the terrain, which is actually really large. So you can see these samples are covering very large sections, and if you have a high enough resolution map and enough detail, then that'll work alright. Since this is a procedural terrain, it has a lot of geometry that will really pick up on details. But if we were to stick with this mode, I would definitely decrease the size of the image sample, the global sample. So if we were to just compare the smaller samples to the large samples, it's obviously a huge difference. So we'll just make a couple of modifications. We could go ahead and bring these down to 0.1 and 0.13. And that should reduce the size a little better, something that'll fit and shouldn't be so pixelated. Maybe we go ahead and bring it down a little further. We'll go ahead 0.06, 0.07. And then we can adjust some of the scale variations. Change the rotation a little more. You can also change the UV coordinates that are used. Right now, I'm using the automatic mode, but we could set it up to a more specific mode if we wanted to. Faces, we could automatic UV, which should be the same as the automatic mode, depending on the type of the terrain. If you're working with a 3D terrain, automatic UV is going to be the best choice. That, or setting it up as a spherical, will also work out pretty nicely. Spherical, cylindrical, those should work pretty well. But I'm going to go back to the automatic mode, and we'll just take a look at this sample size. So now it's starting to look a little better, but the scale of the color brightness variation doesn't really match up with it too much. So we could modify the scale of that, because right now I think it's probably way too big. Not really seeing a lot of variation from the base layer. So what we could do is switch this over. I think what I'd like to do is change it back to the world standard mode. And then what I also want to do is change the preview of the color to a kilometer, just so we can see the color brightness variation at 1 kilometer. Increase that noise scale a little. And maybe turn down the contrast, because it's getting a little too bright. And then I'm going to go over to the multi-image sample and then take the global sample scale and increase that to 10 and 12. And you might not be able to see it in the preview within the editor, but you should be able to see in the main camera preview how that's showing up. Now, I'd probably go in and increase the size and the scale, the global scale of the images a little more. What you could also do is change the overall scale of the material, which will work quite well. You could even just go into the color production function scale down here and modify the size. We could make it 10 times larger, and that might be a bit much. Maybe we'll go ahead and set that to 4. And that's going to be just independent to that channel. So not the overall material, just the color output. So it's a really cool feature, just being able to just automatically load in those image sequences and scatter textures throughout your material. Now, if you're going to be creating your own sequences, the most important thing is to make sure that you cut out around the edges of the surface. If we take a look at one of the images, it doesn't really matter whether or not it's seamless because we're using a sample, just the one individual image, and then that gets scattered around. So if you have seams on the edges or it's just a square texture, then you're just going to see big squares all over the place throughout the surface and the material. So really important to cut out the edges in order for that to work, and then make sure everything is named properly with the right sequence, and that can speed things up in Vue a lot. And here's just a render of that last scale setting with the function scale set to 5. And it's looking pretty good. We could also take another image sampler and connect it to the image combiner if you want to increase the density even more and have different scale samples or use different sequences. There's a lot of flexibility, and now that you can just change the sequence number and just automatically load in the image sequence, we don't need to add individual channels. Makes it really nice, very quick.